Yes, the symposium marks a kind of a end point in the research project, in the funded research project, I should say, because it's of course the research is ongoing. Simply because it's in my own main interest, and I think also in the others. It's been a long wish to research on this topic and to research further. It will be, and I think we will talk about this in more detail also, but in 3 years of research, there's a lot of things that are, so to say, loosely connected or loose-ended. You come to research something, often you get to the surface, then you go deeper, and then it's time to change to something else, and there's a lot of things that accumulate over the time. And we have taken the opportunity also with Tobias Leibetzeder to to create a journal article which will be published in the research catalog. It's still in review, but I can give some preview on it. You see that's actually the canvas of it. It's huge, so it's I think 30,000 times 15,000 pixels. And it covers many things that we have accumulated over the 3 years of research. So you can zoom into any of those clusters of things and research further. We also use this in our presentation as a kind of a jump point to go to some aspect of it and then go further. And thanks to Tobias. Tobias is not here; he's in Iceland, but he has sent us a video work that will be presented in the evening.
Greetings from Iceland.
Greetings from Iceland, yes. So I should introduce the ideas of rotting sounds a little, I think, for all of you that are not so familiar with the project. As has been mentioned, the project deals with the degradation of mainly digital audio. But of course, this is an effect of very fundamental things, of actually the laws of thermodynamics, where the entropy is defined. Entropy describes the order of a system, and physics says that in a closed system, the progression of time is given by the increase of entropy. So the time error pointing to the future is given by the increase of disorder, actually. So this is much connected. It's fundamentally connected, actually. Of course, we are not in a closed system, really. A closed system means there is no exchange of energy from within the system to any other system. But we can create lab situations where this is approximately the case. So when we create experimental systems within our artistic research or within scientific research, one often manages to get a semi-closed system or almost closed system where most of the variables are controlled. And in this case, we have created a number of artworks where we think this is often the case. And there's a second quite fundamental claim by Gilbert Lewis. He says that a gain in entropy, which is connected to the time error, as I said, always means loss of information. So this is the disorder. Loss of information means degradation of digital data, basically. And we can see the compact disc here. As Martin told us, the compact disc is a very volatile data carrier. It's made out of plastic with an aluminum coating. It's, of course, doesn't last very long. But it's interesting for us because, it's also been researched in glitch art, starting with the 80s. When you scratch a CD, interesting sounds come out of it. And we have one exhibition, or one exhibit in the Auditorium of Rotting Sounds, the CD Rot exhibition, where you can listen to that effect. So what we are extremely interested in is this disintegration, the degradation, but not only in digital audio, but with all the contexts that are connected to it. When we speak of digital audio, of course, the information interacts very much with the material. So it's an exchange process. One cannot be without the other, simply because the data has to be stored somewhere, and this is always physical. Even if it's in the cloud, in a virtual data space, the cloud will be hosted on servers that run hard drives or other storage forms that use electrons. And in this case, it's a material. These are particles. This integration also means that things spread out. So the shape of or the form of the material is disintegrated, it spreads out, it forms spores. We call it spores after the mold museum by Dieter Roth. So we are sending out spores in the course of this disintegration. This gives rise to the formation of new aesthetics, of aesthetics that are yet to discover. And in the process, the spores get more and more. The form of the medium will totally change, of course, and this gives rise to a kind of a cross-pollination, as I called it, between things that are in a connection in space or in time. You could imagine that here is another thing that has disintegrated, and the aesthetics entangle, the spores interchange, there's an interchange of information. And so to say, microscopic view, the aesthetics of the original form are completely changed. I have made a composition, we're about to play some sound, in 2018 that dealt with the aesthetics of MP3 artifacts. So it's actually only made out of artifacts that are derived from MP3 compression. It has to be said that this is not the MP3 compression that is usually used, but it's a kind of a tweaked compression, but it uses the same algorithms. And I have tried to get out as much variety in artifacts as possible. It's a short excerpt. Originally, this is a 24-minute piece. It was just a snippet. It's called Residuals. One quite important aspect of research has also been the dealing with terminology. Degradation, disintegration, rot are quite negatively connotated, one would think. And already in the manifesto that we wrote in, I think, 2018, right? Was published at the Politics of the Machine conference. We have tried to invent terms that are a little more constructive, a little more forward thinking or forward pointing. So we usually also use the term of transformation to when we talk about disintegration. Oh, it's not just going away or vanishing or disappearing, but it's these particles that are very interesting, and so one could maybe more constructively talk about a transformation in time. Erosion is also, I mean, it's a scientific term, or from geology probably, a little negative, but it's interesting because it's shape changing. No? Whenever something changes, it gives rise to new aesthetic. And patina is a quite interesting term, and Almut has written about it in the research catalog and also the Society of Artistic Research conference. Will you talk about this?
A little bit, yes.
Oh. So as an example of an artwork that has been produced in the Auditorium of Rotting Sounds, I haven't mentioned it, but the Auditorium of Rotting Sounds is a part of the MDW campus. It's behind the library. Any of you that will be here in the evening will have the chance to visit it. It's our permanent exploration space, exhibition space. Unfortunately, there is no open doors at these times because of COVID regulations, but we hope to reopen it at some point. But it can be visited with personal tours. And we have we have assembled 10 or 11 artworks that are on permanent display. And one is this antenna sculpture by Juliana Herrero and myself. And I mentioned it here because it has a very interesting way of working, namely between the digital audio domain and the materials or the context of it. It's a wire sculpture with this base plate on the ground, and it sends out a manifesto by Luci Russolo, L'arte dei rumori, the arts of noises. It recites this text. I have an example here. The text is telegraphed. And it's transmitted from the antenna, which is the wire sculpture, and then it's read back into the system. And it goes on, and of course errors are introduced. You can watch the text changing on a small display inside the auditorium. And it fulfills the wish of Luci Russolo of the introduction of noise very pretty. And this artwork is quite sensitive because it rests on the lawn there, and there's a lawnmower, and there's children from the kindergarten visiting the antenna, and it has been a very interesting process to keep it intact and to see also how much do we have to interfere with it, and how much can it be left alone, or can it be exposed to the influences. I think you would talk about this. And also, of course, as you hear, this is the recording that is taken from the antenna, which is then fed into the system. And you can always hear the weather, you can hear the S trains, you can hear people talking. And this feeds into the system. So the whole context feeds into the text, folds with the text. Just a little note on the digital nature of things. When we started, Mareie Ballmann, a technologist from Amsterdam, was with us, and she mentioned that in the electrical terms, there's no such thing as 1 and 0, and even in nature, of course, there isn't. It's always fuzzy. And this I find very interesting. When we think of zeros and ones or low and high, it's always quite jumpy. But in effect, it's actually so that there are thresholds when something is low or something is high. And this is, you can see from 0 to 5 volts, which is a TTL standard of electrical signals. So everything below 0.8 volts would be 0. Everything between 2 and 5 volts would be 1. and there is a region where it's undefined. And this is, of course, very interesting, because what happens then? No, does it jump between the two, or is there like a hysteresis? So it's a region which is not covered by the logic of the digital system. And you can see there's an input side of it and an output side. So the input side is more fuzzy than the output side. And on the output side, there is a larger gap, and the signals are better defined. So one should stay at 0 or at 5 volts more than on the input side. So whenever we talk about digital, it's not really digital. It's always a fuzzy thing that we construct. And one example is the disk that you can see in the lobby. It's called reference tone. Here it is. It's a printed representation of a 1 kilohertz tone. That's why it's called reference tone. It's a 1-bit encoding. That means that there is no 16-bit PCM words as on a CD, but it's just zeros and ones, and it's a very clever encoding, very simple encoding that embeds the sound that one wants to hear in high-frequency noise. So there's a lot of noise in it, but one can scan it with a photodiode, and one could then read out the sound again. But what you can see here, it's printed, and of course it's very fuzzy. But even though it's possible to read out the sound, and yeah, this is the tone. That's it, no? I mean, it's 10 seconds worth on the disk, not more. And the more people will step on it, so you're invited to step on it, the more the tone will change. It will more and more also capture the context of where it's lying. That's why we have put it in the lobby, so that everyone is supposed, or accidentally steps on it, or is supposed to step on it, or scratch it with the cards, or whatever. So I will take this opportunity to give the word to who? Almut. Yes, pass my word to Almut. Please.
Thank you. And we choose this research catalog as kind of publication for this talk to be kind of more interactive with each other, and just to show you the way of kind of methodical approach to publish artistic research. Well, I'm basically, since I was introduced, I'm coming from the conservation kind of profession, and so I'm always really interested in how to, in the way of transforming, to preserve it or to keep it, or at least to how to understand how we can perceive or how we can approach artworks in different kinds of eras and in different kinds of societies. It's always a big issue in how to document. So I kind of put my focus on this kind of topic. And since Thomas mentioned, we established right in the beginning of our project the Auditorium of Rotting Sounds, where we kind of want to manifest physically and digitally our written words of the manifesto. So basically to study the nature of decay and evaluate or examine the relationship between the microscopic and macroscopic processes, the information and the information carrier, the physical materials and the conceptual objects, which are the artworks. And basically we just want to put it there and let it go and let it rot and let it decay and let it left by its own. But since Thomas already mentioned, with the beginning of the establishment of the Auditorium of Rotting Sounds, we start thinking, or we start realizing that it's kind of hard because they are changing in a kind of direction which is not really intended, or basically which we cannot really use productively or artistically. So we start thinking about how to kind of keep track, or so in the conservation we say how to maintain it. which basically is a kind of the opposite what actually was the idea, to just let it rot and let it transform itself and just perceive the whole entropy in its fulfillment. We start to think about how to do it. And when we consider the archive of rotting sounds as a kind of archive, so the archive in a sense of not like you talked about, but more in a kind of more vivid or like a living organism, an archive like something society can base on and can found on and can develop itself. An archive like something like a household where the relationships in between need to be balanced, and an archive which is accessible, and an archive for artists. An archive for artists where they can go back and then choose or use the things they already produced and then create new things out of it. So basically, what is the definition of an archive? An archive is an organization of information which needs to be accessible for a designated community. So if we use this kind of definition for the archive or the auditorium of rotting sounds, so we have like the basic, the archive, so the space, the dedicated space, where the self-generating or self-transforming artworks are inside, or basically just placed, because inside is a kind of closed word, and it's not really inside, because antenna, for example, it's outside, and it's always discussing and reading and talking or interacting with the environment. So yeah, there's dedicated space containing this local specific auditive artworks, which are eroding and transforming and migrating permanently in a kind of defined and controlled process. And it's being shaped by the user, or let's say better by the creator or by the artist, which we are, and by the recipients. So basically, most of the artworks are not just interacting with the environment, they are interacting with the visitor. So you're basically influencing how the sound is shaped. So it's there are no really limited borders. There's everything coming together. So it's like really, this is this kind of fluid and living organism. And to think about the auditorium of rotting sounds as an archive we are using and developing permanently, which there's no limit in development. We basically should then kind of maintain it in this way, so to keep it accessible and readable. And we then have to, so we decided kind of this and kind of had this discussion going on. And so then we tried to make kind of framework to how to maintain it, basically. And within this framework, we had those questions: how basically gain control, how to shape the environment, which is basically kind of hard because the auditorium is not climatized, which is the kind of idea of it. To have more like the influences of the changing environment, like spring and summer, and more rural. So having a kind of, then in this case, acceleration, which so we would call it in the conservation profession, when we want to do something transforming faster, or like just in a particular way, we're using this kind of accelerated aging. So we're taking one factor or one determinant, and then we are just changing this determinant. So we have like a kind of zooming into this kind of macroscopic, from the macroscopic into the microscopic view, taking all the different parameters and then trying to change just one of them. So just, for example, just taking the material, like from the CD, an optical data carrier, just trying to forces or stressing the polycarbonate, for example, so it's getting warped. And so we define the different layers of the existent, of the object, and then we start to fight against it. And to fight, to learn, to understand, and then to modify it in a special way. And then on the other hand, how to perceive this created aesthetics, which we are producing permanently. And not letting things and objects drifting apart. Like in the sociology, they are making difference between things, which are basically just the physical material, and the objects, which in this case is the artwork and the conceptual idea of it, as like having rotting sounds. And if they are drifting apart, they are kind of losing the balance, and the idea is lost. And it's then not readable anymore as it was intended to be. So that was basically the main goal, keep it readable and not drifting that apart so much. So in this case, or consequently, we developed this metaphor of the handicraft. So in comparison to, for example, an old painter in the Middle Ages, because we had this, even though we had our definitions, the approach was more or less highly intuitive. So we made experimental experiments and then let it stay, and then we changed it because we realized something. So it was really empiricistic approach, and within this metaphor of learning a handicraft and basically giving all artists and basically the society a kind of tool set where they can work with. So at the end, or like right now, we are in this phase where we learned about the specific mechanisms of transformation in its particular medium. We find a way to control the process and to keep it reproducible. So every decay or transformation we generated, it's so in this way reproducible. So it could serve as a kind of tool set for other artists. And to keep the relationship between the household, between things and objects, and basically keep it sustainable, even in the permanently process of transformation. Yeah, here we can see just one of the fragments which got out of it, and the parameters we identified or defined to establishing this research or this kind of handicraft toolset. Yeah, this is just to as you could see in the first picture, there is not, and still it's not, the archive is as a closed space, even though there's a specific place. It's distributed everywhere. So the idea of spores and fragments and transformation and zooming into the microscopic space, which will then elaborate everywhere and just taking as the book, and the book will be transferred to other places, and then it will serve as one fragment or one spore. And so just think about this concept of how to deteriorate and let things decay. You can basically use this concept and project it to other things and to other media temporalities, and it will survive and live forward to all kinds, and which is really embodying this idea of the permanent transformation is our approach to always use this media change and this transformation between the different carriers. As I mentioned, you could differ between the information and the information carrier. And we created different kinds of archive, which are analog and digital, or virtually and physical. And we used, or we made, so to say, sound samples. So every hour, each artwork in the auditorium is recorded for 1 minute. So since the beginning of the auditorium, since the opening, we are collecting the sound samples, and it's like the digital archive is growing and growing. It's on a server, and it's so this transformation into the pure digital, and you can work with it, and you can learn from it, and you can document it, and you can use it as everything you want to. And then we changed back and used randomly those sound examples and printed it, which you can see on the left side, on the bench, on the wooden benches in the auditorium. So you have like just a fragment of it, but still the idea of this artwork, even though it's like completely different. And the next step will be that we will develop a technology to read it out again. So we have this change of media, and this is like always, and this is one main fact we really discovered. And as Thomas said, there's not really a difference between analog and digital. It's like everything is spun together and doesn't care. So it's more, what counts is the conceptual object, the entity of the object, and not the definition of what is digital and analog and what is the actual so to say, artwork, which is basically hanging in the museum, because this is not the artwork. The artwork is everything around it, including this oil painting hanging on the wall. Yeah, as I said, we want to have like a more discussion, so I will have this last slide, which is basically visualizing the digital and physical structure of the or the virtual and physical structure of the archiving thing. So you have like the archive, the user, which is influence, and kind of this feedback between archive and user and or actor and practitioner or recipient. And then there's the distribution into these different kinds of existence, which will erode, and on so forth. And and this kind of difference from the beginning of the objects and everything which is transforming in between, you could kind of understand as a kind of patina. So that's one term we developed within our research project to discuss all this difference, the shaping in between as a kind of patina, because it's not a negative thing, it's just a value. Like the patina is value of age and wisdom and yeah. So Till, don't.
No.
So yeah, we will keep talking as three person, but now I'm giving the word to Till. And yes, it's great.
Yeah. So as I was introduced as the main discussion partner, I think this is what I tried to be my role today. So I took the role of the creator in here, as Almut took the role of the archivist, maybe. And yeah, so I thought of first asking some questions that arose. Well, maybe I start a little bit different. Because of many different things, among others, this COVID situation we had, and I'm living in Berlin, so we had a lot of online collaboration and more or less sporadic talks. So the last 3-4 days were really intense in somehow collecting all these things that we are now presenting to get together and to somehow question them again. And we had some brief discussions about these things, which is what we are planning to do here and continue here on stage also maybe with you. And within especially these 3-4 days of preparation, there were a lot of questions that came up to me as a creator of digital sound materials when it comes to digital rotting or decay or deterioration or the assembling of patina. So one of the questions was, what is the difference between decay, digital rotting, and digital deterioration? I think Thomas already mentioned it a little bit in his part, but I think this is something that we should maybe discuss also a little bit more. There's definitely a little bit of a different connotation to these words. I personally like deterioration because it sounds fancy, maybe, and I don't really know what it is on this kind of very intellectual, or on this kind of intuitive level. So there's a little bit more of a non-negative connotation to it from my side. Another question is, as a creator, I'm asking myself, are there other similar effects to consider, like digital transformation, for example, which is something that is less, where there is maybe also a conscious level involved while doing this, so I can actively transform something while I am not able to actively decay. I can enforce decay, but I cannot like do it explicitly. And one big thing as a creator, if I'm thinking of digital rotting or digital decay of my work, so of my artwork, is like, what are the aesthetic qualities of this rotting? And how does this rotting affect me and my work and me while doing this work? As I said, or as a lot of people already said, decay is inevitable there. So in that sense, it is something that I have to deal with when I consider my work as a long-term process. which is also the answer to the next question, which is why bother to think about digital rotting when working on a new artwork? Because there are lots of people in the history that didn't think about it at all. So there's this kind of certain trust that either it doesn't matter what happens with your artwork because you just spit it out, or you trust that there are people taking care of it. Yeah? Yes, that's where I work. And recently I started to think about, well, Martin Kunze introduced this idea of data as this very abstract level of black and white dots, it was on your slides, of zeros and ones. And this is somehow, it's a very abstract thing because there is no, like, it doesn't really matter on which material we put it in the terms of it being data, and at the same time, it doesn't have a it doesn't have any kind of meaning if we do not know how to interpret it. And so we can look at a digital artwork, or as working with a digital artwork as a sort of using it as a material, the digitality, and putting it together, or, and this is maybe a different way of thinking about it, as thinking of using the way of how to interpret the things as a canvas on which we are working. So a canvas in the sense of a medium onto which we put our ideas, and that also shapes the way of how these ideas are then perceived later on. I don't know if that is clear, but it goes a little bit into the direction of the question that was asked in your talk, Martin, about like how to get this kind of like physicality of things into your archive as well. But I'm kind of talking about the physicality of the digital here a little bit more. Yeah. So other questions are, what are strategies to deal with decay and how to integrate digital rotting into my work without it dominating my work process and my artwork, which is something that I think we dealt a lot with during this project because, well, the project is about rotting sounds, so there is this idea of really dealing with the rotting process itself, so it was always kind of a main feature there, but at the same time, there are other ideas. I mean, I don't want, as an artist, I don't want to spend all my time with working only with the material. I want to work, well, within the material. Like, I also want to kind of present my own ideas there. And finally, should I create my own digital tools there, or codecs, or material, or program, or canvas? This is going a different way. So, some thoughts. Degradation is a process. I think you would agree on that, would you?
I do.
That's wonderful. So, and it can be directed somehow directed, but not really like explicitly put there and anticipated, but generally it is unsupervised in the sense of it is happening kind of on its own without my influence there. And it is incidental in its very nature, which somehow means that statistically I can say that certain things will happen, but in the individual piece I cannot tell for sure that that bit will flip, for example. Degradation is dependent on the medium on and with which the artwork is produced. So as I try to explain the difference for me as interpreting the digital medium as a canvas, so as some kind of background on which I work, versus the medium as a material, as some kind of like foreground on which I work. So I'm working in the medium or I'm working with the medium, which is again the question of, and these questions like that I asked before is not something that I want to now answer and say like this is the case, but it's something that you have to deal with while somehow getting into the idea of working and being conscious about digital decay. Still going the other way around, the mouse. So data structures as material, we talked already about these works a little bit, or at least one of them is something that Almut and me put into the auditorium, which is the CD-ROT project. Here you see a little bit of a more proper picture of it. And here we are using the aesthetics inherent to the used data structure and the codec itself. So codec, for anyone not knowing about this, is kind of like the recipe of how to interpret the data that is presented, for example, on the CD. And yeah, so this piece might sound like this. And maybe here you can also...
Tools are dependent on a complex and heavily established technological infrastructure, a fundamental principle.
So with this piece from Almut and me, it was kind of like there are 6 CD players that play more or less identical, well, in the beginning identical CDs on repeat, and you hear them all in parallel, and they were, well, at least originally started at the same time. This might have changed, and also Almut did a lot of meticulous work on reading out the CDs and see if they're still readable. So lots of work there. But over the course of the last 3 years, the quality of the playback of this system somehow started to degrade more and more. And well, the observation as an artist there was that we had a certain idea of what will happen, and in some way it turned out to happen like that, I would say. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. At the same time, it also took these 3 years to do this. So if you want to like really do this you want to observe degradation on a concrete example, you need to have the time to do that. So also, I think we talked about this in the very beginning as well, that like 3 years for a research project is a long time, but at the same time, if you're researching degradation processes, is nothing, because we are talking about time spans of more than 3 years, or even in this digital realm. So, on the other hand, this is kind of a different approach where I took this idea of data as an abstract entity which needs to be interpreted. I used this in this performance piece called buffer manipulation, where I load in a bunch of data 3 times. Actually, this is why there are 3 columns, so you see this down here. So I load 3 times a bunch of data which happen to be field recordings or other kind of data, also non-audio data, into some buffer structures which were basically floating point values, one after the other, and then interpreted these in different ways parallel. So this might sound like this. So there are different interpretation levels of the same data superimposed on top of each other. So these chirps that you hear there, for example, is interpreting the buffer as an FFT. No. Well, doing an FFT on the buffer and playing that back, so you hear basically the frequency spectrum of that as a sonification of the buffer. But also like playing it back on different speeds, for example, and also like encoding it with different codecs. It might get much noisier, not in this particular part. And on the other hand, we can look at data structures as a canvas. And this is something that I personally found kind of interesting to look at, because there is this tendency in this digital world to think of an ideal canvas as something that is completely transparent, so that you do not notice it, and that it is kind of time indifferent unless you consciously intend to alter it in a way. So if we are thinking of the common ways of store sound on a computer or digitally, then there is, for example, the MP3 or the WAV file encodings, which all try to somehow develop a method that you can compress the amount, or that you don't need so much space to store the song, for example, but at the same time it should just sound as it was done before. So this is our idea here. But like, if you think, or if I, as a naive person that never studied art history, about the ideal canvas from a creator's perspective, then it is something that is also informing my work. So there is always a way, also if I work digitally with audio, the way, like the tools that I'm using are informing, and the tools on which I put my piece are always informing my piece as well, which we've heard, for example, yesterday in the wonderful performance on the tapes by Angelika. So the ideal canvas from me as a creator is that I can purposefully select it to serve or enhance or complement my work, and which somehow also means that I need to have a certain familiarity with this medium. So on that level, I spent quite some time and effort and brain with Dario, who is sitting over there, who also played yesterday here, to create a library in Faust for doing 1-bit audio generation and filtering, which I think is the sound example. Which is like highly informs, and I think this is something that we heard yesterday, especially in Dario's piece. It is highly informing the output and the aesthetic qualities of the piece that is then, well, generated, or that is coming out of this process in a way. So there's a lot of thought going into getting familiar with the canvas structure in a way. Yeah, and last not least, I thought of just like mentioning different methods of researching that we somehow applied during our research project, which is inducing feedback on various levels and from different perspectives, which is something that helps a lot, like feedback in the sense of auditory feedback, but also in the sense of communication feedback. But somehow feedback always helps to reveal the structure itself. So it is not so much about the initial content that you put into a system, but by having this content feeding back in the system, you're somehow getting an idea of how the system itself behaves in a way. Trial and failure was also a lot there. I think if I go up a little bit, so here you see a little bit of the different approaches that we did. There's a lot of too fragile here and things that just didn't work out. So there's a lot of established media that is impossible to work with on the level of somehow manipulating it, because it just results in silence, or the structures are too small. Like you cannot, like with normal tools, you cannot manipulate embedded technology as much as you might want to in order to get to something that is interesting on that level. Yeah. So now I talked a lot. You started to get up, so it looks like you wanted to say something.
No, I think we should like open
Yes.
questions as for moderators, since our first. Yes.
Yeah, maybe we can give space for like one question from the audience if there is. We also want to just briefly mention Almut Schilling will be joining the panel discussion, so any questions can be addressed also then. And again, post-it are on the tables outside, so feel free to always write your comments or questions there as well. But if anyone from the audience have a question now, we have still a few minutes.
Is the Rotting Sound project, which is obviously located here in the university, also intended as a kind of outcry to the museums, to the conservations institutions? You mentioned the canvas, and I find it a very nice image to, if the oil paint had the same half-life as digital data, our museums would be full of empty frames. Is this one of the intentions of the project?
I think that's the perfect question.
Yeah, I think it's definitely intention, because since I kind of tried to elaborate in my talk that thinking about that everything, all objects around us are transforming permanently. And so there's not really nothing to freeze in one specific cut-off time. So, and museums try to tend to do this in the objects, because they try to think about authenticity and what's the real environment for the artwork and what is the original. And coming from our perspective, try to influence the museums, how to think about the growing and the evolving of an artwork, which could be basically an oil painting or a sound art. So there is not. I think it's interesting to discuss this on a more abstract level too. And this approach is definitely fruitful. It was for me completely, and I hope to influence the museums, especially conservators, because they used to be really conservative about this approach there.
I think Caroline Bovermann will then talk about this, right? Yeah, the second keynote.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting, so I would say it is an outcry to all of us in a way, because I was not so, well, I worked a lot with digital material before this project happened, and I was really happy to be invited to be part of this project. Thank you. But I would have said that I knew a lot about digital technology before I started this project. But yeah, no. No, I think we are using it as a transparent medium a lot, and too much actually, and a little bit. I think the art genre of glitch somehow already revealed that there's something that can be observed and used also as a material, but the idea of decay is something that is it's very important to think about and to consider and to have in the back of your head, and maybe also forget about at some point. But I think there should be a conscious decision about forgetting about it. And at the moment we are just floating in a way on that level. And there's this, like the recent hype around NFC, this like cryptocurrency thing for digital art, which somehow creates a new original. I think this is something that maybe we can discuss about this later, but I think it's kind of interesting because everyone is jumping on that, because this is creating the new original, and then you can have something that you can preserve again, and it's like, yeah, it's not copyable. And like, anyway. Yeah.